welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're untaking what I think is a really necessary and rigorous analysis of radical ideology. We're opening up Chris Hedges' work, American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. And this is, well, it's a deep examination of a specific movement.
A very specific movement. And it's absolutely essential to frame this correctly right from the start, just as Hedges himself does.
Right.
This is a critical examination of a highly politicized, structurally organized ideological movement.
Okay.
It is not, and I really want to stress this, it's not a general theological critique of Christianity.
So he's not talking about the religion as a whole.
Not at all. He's using political, sociological, and historical tools to analyze a group that seeks political control, and they do it through the mechanism of religious rhetoric.
The term he uses is Christofascism.
That's the one.
Okay, so let's unpack this central thesis. Hedges' argument, his core argument, is that the radical Christian right shows many, many characteristics of historical fascism.
Yes, and to make that case, he leans very heavily on the late Italian philosopher Umberto Eco.
Specifically his concept of fascism.
Fascism, or eternal fascism, exactly. And what Eco did was outline a set of features that can appear in all sorts of different contexts.
And the idea is that they don't all have to be present at once, right?
That's the scaffolding of the whole analysis. Eco believed that, just one or two of these features can allow the ideology to, as he put it, coagulate.
And Hedges sees the very first feature of fascism in this movement. He calls it the cult of tradition.
The courts of tradition. And it's so much more than just, simple nostalgia.
It's not just about looking back fondly.
No. It's an intellectual quest for a kind of revelation that was supposedly received at the dawn of human history, something that's been concealed or lost.
So it's a rejection of modern rational thought.
Precisely. It's an ancient reaction against the rationalism that started with the classical Greeks. And in its modern form, it shows up as this search for a hidden truth.
Hedges points out you can find things like St. Augustine mixed with, Stonehenge on the same New Age shelf.
Exactly. It's about mixing these disparate ideas to find some kind of primordial, concealed revelation. It isn't interested in a dialogue with history. It wants a perfect, singular, revealed past.
Which makes the rejection of the modern world completely integral to its survival as an ideology.
It does. I mean, traditionalism has to reject modernism. If you look at historical fascists in, say, Italy or Germany, they might have celebrated certain technologies.
Yeah. Aircraft or radio, sure.
But the core ideology was still rooted in these very romantic, pre-Enlightenment ideas, things like blood and earth.
And for the movement Hedges is analyzing, the target is the Enlightenment itself.
The Age of Reason. They see that period as the absolute beginning of modern depravity. It's when humanity, in their view, placed human reason above divine authority.
And if the entire intellectual tradition of the West is fundamentally corrupt, then the movement needs a kind of internal cohesion that rejects critical thought. And this is where it gets really interesting. Fascism has a specific belief about critical thought. For fascism, disagreement it's labeled as treason.
That is the crucial political function of traditionalism. Disagreement is seen as a sign of diversity, and fascism just exploits that natural human fear of difference.
So there's only one perfect revealed truth.
Then any deviation, any questioning, any nuance at all becomes an act of betrayal against the community and against God. And that concept, you see, provides the entire ideological infrastructure for intolerance and for authoritarian hierarchy.
And that structural need for a single monolithic belief, it leads directly into the core political idea of the radical Christian right, which is dominionism.
Dominionism is absolutely central. It's an explicitly political movement.
It gets its name from Genesis.
From Genesis 1.26, where God grants humanity dominion over creation. But the dominionist interpretation is extremely specific.
Oh, so?
It demands that true American Christians exercise godly dominion over every single sphere and institution of human society.
So we're not just talking about converting individuals.
No. We're talking about seizing control of schools, of government, media, the arts, the economy, everything.
That's a huge leap from traditional evangelicalism, which focuses more on personal salvation.
It's a different project entirely. This is about establishing political supremacy. Hedges notes that this ideology has characteristics that are typical of fascism, particularly the strident call for the moral and physical supremacy of a master race.
Which in this context means American Christians.
The righteous who are called to rule. It's a theology that has been repurposed for conquest. It views the existing democratic, pluralistic state as fundamentally illegitimate until it's governed by divine law, not human law.
So the rhetoric is about colonization, reclaiming something that was stolen.
It is. As one reverend in Hedges' sources put it, the movement appropriates religious and patriotic language to just deny the validity of any other way of being. They're systematically assigning everyone else, secularists, liberals, minorities, a supporting role in a story that only empowers them.
It's a system designed to deny pluralism from the very beginning.
At its roots, yes.
Okay, let's move on to the theological engine that powers this. The idea of apocalyptic warfare. How does the movement use Scripture to create this culture of permanent conflict?
The mechanism is what Hedges calls selective literalism. They claim the Bible is the literal, infallible word of God, but in practice, they do a kind of theological cherry-picking.
So they find the parts that fit their ideology.
They select the passages that conform to their ideology of rage, of self-aggrandizement, intolerance, and they ignore or distort the texts that preach things like mercy or humility or love. They need these specific passages to give sacred authority to their political program.
And this focus on battle lines up perfectly with another feature of fascism, the idea that life is lived for struggle, not the struggle for life.
That's right. It translates directly into a stance of permanent warfare, both spiritual and political. Life is this unceasing, zero-sum war against the forces of depravity. And that mindset generates what he calls the Armageddon complex.
The final cataclysmic battle.
Exactly. Because they see their enemies as literal agents of Satan, those enemies have to be utterly destroyed in a final battle that will grant the movement total control of the world.
But Hedges points out a profound paradox in that, one that no fascist leader has ever really solved. If the goal is total victory, that implies an era of peace after, a golden age. So how do you sustain an ideology based on permanent conflict if the conflict is supposed to end?
The ideological catch-22, isn't it? The entire infrastructure of the movement, its cohesion, its purpose, its ability to demand loyalty, it all relies on the existence of the enemy.
So what happens if the enemy is gone?
If the Antichrist and the secularists are destroyed, what sustains the movement? Fascism cannot survive peace. So the golden age of peace is always promised, but it must never, ever actually arrive, or the whole engine just stalls.
The conflict has to be maintained.
Even if it means inventing new threats.
And the text they rely on most heavily to justify this is the book of Revelation, which is striking because Martin Luther basically relegated it to the back of the Bible.
He did. But for this worldview, Revelation is critically important, precisely because it bypasses all nuance, all dialogue. It paints this terrifying, unsparing vision of a final battle between Christ and the Antichrist.
And it culminates in the total destruction of non-believers.
They're cast alive into a lake of fire. It's designed not just to inspire zealotry among followers, but to justify total, unforgiving malice toward opponents.
The imagery Hedges pulls out it's genuinely gruesome. We're not just talking about symbolic warfare.
No.
He talks about the great supper of God, where birds of prey are invited to feast on human remains. The flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men.
It's a sanctioning of horrific violence, a display of God's most ruthless power unleashed on those who are deemed unworthy. And Revelation isn't the only text that provides this kind of sacred authority for vengeance.
He mentions the Exodus story, which is usually seen as a story of liberation.
But when you view it through this lens of selective literalism, it can be weaponized. Specifically, the parts where God orders the killing of Egyptian firstborn and tells Moses to loot the Egyptians' homes.
And says, I have made sport of the Egyptians. That's a powerful authorization for cruelty.
It is. When the Dominionists use these texts, they foster this religious chauvinism and intolerance. Hedges argues that this kind of literature in the Bible keeps alive the virus of hatred. It provides a continuous justification for apocalyptic terror in God's name.
Which leads to the ultimate moral absolutism.
The moral universe is just divided into two irreconcilable halves.
He says apocalyptic visions have historically inspired genocidal killers.
They nourish the butchers of the Inquisition, the Crusades, even Nazi ideologues. And what's fascinating is how the movement uses this vision to rationalize brutality.
How do they do that?
Non-believers are seen not just as opponents, but as pollutants, viruses, mutations that must be eradicated. They argue this cleansing is necessary to stop societal degeneration and bring in their utopian Christian state.
So the victim's right to self-preservation is just completely denied.
And this framing allows the perpetrators to avoid all moral responsibility. The brutality they inflict is not human malice, it's sanctified, it's divine wrath.
The cruelty isn't their fault.
Exactly. They see themselves as instruments of God's will. And in a terrible irony, the victims are blamed for their own suffering because, in the eyes of the Dominionists, they defied God.
That is a chilling observation. Let's shift now to how this ideology actually translates into controlling the lives and minds of followers. How do you deconstruct an individual's sense of autonomy?
Well, it starts with the binary moral structure. The world is simplified into these absolute, non-negotiable opposites.
Obedience versus rebellion.
Purity versus corruption.
Chosen versus damned.
Saved versus unsaved. There's no gray area, no room for dialogue or self-doubt.
And this simplification changes the concept of the individual itself. You mentioned fascism sees the people as a monolithic entity.
Right. Which means that individuals, as unique, autonomous beings, they basically have no rights separate from the collective. The structure is hierarchical.
And the authority figures, the idols, they provide the rules.
Definitive, non-negotiable rules for living. And the key psychological function here is that it removes the anxiety of moral choice.
Which Hedges calls the fundamental anxiety of human existence.
And for people who feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the modern world, this is a huge source of attraction. It's a source of comfort.
You trade your autonomy for certitude.
But as Hedges rightly warns, people who act without doubt are frightening. Doubt is a necessary part of ethical action.
Of course.
The movement thrives on suppressing that internal conflict. By submerging their personal identities into the single persona of the Christian crowd, followers get this powerful sense of belonging and purpose. The flight from personal autonomy isn't experienced as a loss of freedom.
It's a relief.
It's a welcome relief from the burden of complex decisions, especially for those who came to the movement fleeing despair or addiction or uncertainty.
And that psychological relief is often engineered during recruitment, isn't it? Through programs like evangelism explosion.
The training is explicitly predatory. It seeks out the most vulnerable people in crisis, going through a divorce, job loss, addiction, abuse. The manuals actually instruct evangelists to identify with the prospect's loneliness, to get all over that with your testimony.
They leverage vulnerability to create reliance.
And the language is aggressive, it's militaristic.
The metaphors of war and sex are just everywhere. Christians as soldiers in the army of Jesus Christ, they're told, don't show your gun until you're ready to shoot it.
And conversion is likened to the term consummate the witness. It's language designed to frame recruitment not as sharing faith, but as a decisive military victory.
And after conversion, loyalties are immediately shifted.
Yes. New converts are often separated from their unsaved family and friends. The movement claims to be about restoring the family unit, but Hedges argues it's often the great divider. The movement's mission is placed above even family ties.
And the most powerful tool for enforcing this conformity is the personal conversion testimony, the one from the EE workbook.
It's meticulously crafted. It has to follow 3 rigid stages that eliminate any room for personal nuance or genuine spiritual exploration.
Stage 1 is life before.
But it has to focus on a single negative concept, like fear of death. Stage 2 is the moment of receiving eternal life.
And stage 3 is the reverse concept. Courage replaces fear.
So the life story is completely standardized. It becomes a generic evangelical tool. The personal narrative is just subsumed by the required ideological structure.
And the explicit goal here is to achieve total certitude, to eliminate the fear of death.
Which makes for a fearless, unquestioning soldier.
Absolutely. And to force that submission, they use what you might call the quantification of sin.
Explain that.
They need to use a kind of pseudo-mathematical logic to convince converts that their sinfulness is inescapable, and therefore their own good works are useless.
This is that staggering calculation he described. Yes. An instructor might argue that even if you're so good, you only commit 3 sins a day. 1 sin of attitude, 1 hateful word, 1 missed good deed.
That's still 1,000 violations against God's law every year.
And if you live to be, say, 59, that's 59,000 violations. This calculation is the mechanism that removes human agency. It proves that earning your way into heaven is impossible.
So you require absolute non-negotiable submission.
To Jesus Christ alone. The conversion prayer they repeat verbatim, I am a sinner. I have been trusting in myself, but now I place my trust in you. That's the contractual seal on the deconstruction of the individual's moral autonomy.
And once that surrender is complete, the follower is ready for deployment.
The goal is no longer just spiritual salvation. As D. James Kennedy made clear, it's about building a Christian America. They are recruiting legions into a political movement to impose a theocracy.
Okay, so once you have these legions, you have to maintain cohesion. And that brings us to the mechanics of defining enemies and scapegoats.
You can't sustain an ideology of permanent warfare without a clearly defined enemy. This is standard operating procedure for fascism.
It appeals against the intruders.
Which makes it racist, by definition, regardless of the target. And it relies on this obsession with a plot, a secret conspiracy, to make followers feel perpetually besieged and righteous.
Pat Robertson's book, The New World Order, is a good example of that plot obsession.
It sets the whole framework. If there's a secret, insidious enemy, then a constant state of alert is justified. And today, the classic scapegoats have been supplemented by a host of modern phantom enemies.
Gays, secular liberals, immigrants, Muslims.
These groups serve the function of keeping believers in a frightened state of alert, ready to support repressive measures against anyone who threatens the purity of the movement.
And the fascist trait machismo shows up as a profound war on women.
It's more than just sexism. It implies a real disdain for women's independence and a condemnation of any non-standard sexual habits.
The movement enforces rigid patriarchal authority in the home as a template for the state.
Exactly. You have the Promise Keepers, a mass movement that called on men to take back their role as head of the household, citing Ephesians 5.22, wives to be submissive to your husbands, to give this structure biblical authority.
And they barred women from their rallies,
reinforcing the message that a woman's role is purely supportive and outside the sphere of leadership.
And someone like Dr. James Dobson at Focus on the Family. He's been hugely influential in operationalizing these roles.
Oh, massively. Dobson's advice to wives is that submission is essential to make the home a haven for the husband. He claims this absolute authority is what men want most.
He says a wife's choice not to submit is a violation of God's law.
The male as master, female as obedient structure is critical, because the movement cannot tolerate the existence of independent women. If a woman challenges the God-ordained chain of command in the home, the entire theocratic hierarchy, from the family all the way up to the state, is challenged.
And the most relentlessly targeted enemy is the LGBTQ community.
The hostility is deep and systemic. It operates through the ex-gay movement, like Love One Out, which was sponsored by Focus on the Family. They frame homosexuality not as a natural variance, but as a form of masculine inferiority.
They use theories like Dr. Joseph Nicolosi's,
which posits that gay men are suffering from the mama's boy phenomenon, a result of distant fathers. These theories pathologize their existence.
And the political rhetoric around gay marriage is extraordinary. Dobson compared proponents to the Nazis.
The language is meant to be inflammatory, to paralyze. They warn that redefining marriage could lead to societal collapse, that it could lead to polygamy or even fathers marrying their daughters.
And this fear-mongering supports a clear political goal:
a systematic removal of LGBTQ rights, banning adoption, military service, and reinstating sodomy laws. The necessity is to paint homosexual behavior as barbarity, gross, unnatural, and dangerous.
They have to fuel rage against those who defy the moral order.
Because their very existence challenges the movement's rigid, God-ordained, binary structure and the cult of masculinity that forms the foundation of their proposed theocratic state.
This brings us to how the movement constructs its own version of reality: pseudoscience and creationism. This feels like it requires building a whole separate epistemic system.
That's a good way to put it. Since the Enlightenment is seen as depraved, critical thinking is treasonous. In their educational systems homeschooling, Christian Academy students are explicitly taught to obey, not to question or analyze.
They're indoctrinated, not educated.
And the conflict here is historical. It goes back to the rise of modern geology and biology. The work of Lyell and Darwin was truly catastrophic for biblical literalists.
It destroyed their timeline.
Lyell's geology showed the Earth was millions of years old, not created in 4004 BC. And then Darwin delivered the final blow, reducing humans from divinely created beings to just another species descended from primates.
It stripped away the idea that the universe revolves around them.
Exactly, which is why creationism is so ideologically necessary. They have to preserve the literal truth of the Bible, which says that death and suffering only entered the world after Adam's sin.
And if Darwin is right, then death and suffering existed long before humans.
Which undermines the very purpose of Christ's sacrifice, challenges miracles, and weakens the whole apocalyptic narrative. This alternative, non-reality-based world has to be shielded at all costs.
The Creation Museum is the concrete example of this engineered reality.
It's a perfect illustration of a contrived reality designed to prove that God's word is true. The claims are purely pseudoscientific.
So they really have dinosaurs and humans coexisting.
Oh, yes. Docile, herbivorous dinosaurs living with Adam and Eve. And they claim they were stored on Noah's Ark with only young adults sent aboard because the Ark couldn't fit the fully grown ones.
And they frame actual paleontology as just false assumptions.
As a story that only ends up as facts in public schools. Hedges draws on Hannah Arendt's concept of nihilistic relativism here. Once facts become worthless, kept, or discarded based on an ideological test, then truth itself collapses. Lies become truth, and reality is simply whatever the authority figure says it is.
And this assault extends beyond just geology. It reaches into public health.
Absolutely. The movement promotes what they call fundamentalist science to give their beliefs a modern veneer. They use discredited studies to argue against the effectiveness of condoms or to manipulate AIDS research. Hedges details how officials in the Bush administration worked to suppress science that conflicted with this vision.
Which leads us to the alliance at the heart of the movement's financial power, the prosperity gospel and capitalist theocracy.
And this is where the money comes in. This is a linchpin of the movement's modern success. The prosperity gospel is a radical theology that preaches that Jesus wants his followers to be rich.
Wealth and power are reframed as divine blessings.
It's an irrefutable sign of God's favor. It basically sanctions consumerism and opulent displays of faith. The Christian celebrity culture reinforces this.
Figures like Dee Simmons, with her diamond cross, seeing her wealth as a sign of God's favor.
It fuses celebrity culture and consumerism into a single mandate. Financial success is a sign of God's work, and poverty is often seen as a sign of moral failure or weak faith. And crucially, this ideology gets huge financial backing from major corporations. Because it champions ruthless, unfettered capitalism, it effectively provides a religious mandate for exploitation.
So corporate abuse of workers, low wages, union busting is just accepted.
It's celebrated as part of America's heritage of freedom. This ideology seeks to reduce the American working class to global serfdom. Anything that costs corporations money, health benefits, regulations, fair wages is an ungodly restriction on freedom.
They don't just reject regulation, they equate taxation with sin.
Yes. Their textbook, America's History, calls income tax idolatry and property tax theft. They reject the idea that elected officials should be swayed by the needs of the majority.
They should be swayed by correct principles.
Meaning the principles of free market dominionism. It is a theological justification for a corporate oligarchy.
And the media empire that spreads this, like the Trinity Broadcasting Network, TBN, is where you see the mechanics of compulsory giving.
TBN, with Paul and Jan Crouch, was a multi-million-dollar machine. They lived in ostentatious opulence, private jets, lavish homes, gaudy gold sets.
The $1 million wedding gown with mink trim.
All of it presented to viewers as proof that God blesses those who give generously. But this compulsory giving is enforced through intense psychological pressure, through fear.
The hosts warn viewers that failing to contribute means they are robbing God.
And that they'll lose their heavenly reward. It's fear-based extortion. Paul Crouch Sr. once publicly proclaimed death to anything or anyone that will lift a hand against this network. It shows their intolerance for critique. And this mechanism ensures continuous funding, often from followers who are themselves struggling, clinging to the promise of a miracle.
Okay, so let's bring this all back to the political endgame, the tactical pursuit of a theocratic state. Hedges argues this involves a fundamental redefinition of core democratic concepts. It's like ideological newspeak.
He calls it a linguistic twist worthy of George Orwell. The key is twisting the language. For the Christian right, liberty stops meaning freedom of expression or respect for other ways of being.
What does it mean for them?
Their textbooks explicitly define liberty as fealty to the Spirit of the Lord.
So true liberty is only achieved when the state perfectly aligns with their interpretation of God's will.
Which necessitates the eradication of secular humanists and different moral codes. Liberty becomes tyranny for anyone outside the fold.
And the denial that America was founded as a Christian nation is presented as the great deception.
Right, and the long-term legal strategy they use is something called logicide, the perversion of justice. The goal is to condemn opponents to moral and legal oblivion by dismantling universal human rights and setting up a legal system that promotes Bible-believing Christians above everyone else.
To maintain this bubble, they build parallel and insular systems, shadow structures.
They understand that control requires controlling the narrative. They have a massive media ecosystem, TV networks, thousands of radio stations, to keep followers in a closed loop of information.
And the educational component is critical.
Between 1 and 2 million children are homeschooled or in Christian schools where they are not taught evolution or critical analysis. They are explicitly taught to obey. They're indoctrinated with the myth of a Christian America, preparing them to be unquestioning soldiers in public life.
At the same time, you have political organizations operating in the shadows.
Groups like the Council for National Policy operate in intense secrecy. They bring together radical activists, Republican politicians, and wealthy corporate patrons to plot the movement's strategy. It's the nexus of the Christo-fascist and corporate alliances.
And this political strategy has very real-world entry points, like subverting the electoral process.
Hedges gives the chilling example of Ohio's Secretary of State J. Kenneth Blackwell during the 2004 election.
He oversaw voting systems with all sorts of irregularities.
And he systematically sought to disqualify tens of thousands of voters, disproportionately impacting African Americans and Democrats through technical registration requirements.
Can you just remind us of how absurd those requirements were?
They were designed solely to disqualify people. Blackwell demanded voter registration forms be printed on white, uncoated paper of not less than 80-pound text weight.
An utterly arbitrary rule.
It has no bearing on a person's eligibility to vote, but it provided a mechanism to use a state office to subvert democracy under the guise of technical compliance.
Which shows the movement's willingness to, as Hedges says, throw democracy out the window.
Precisely. They operate on the principle that this isn't a political disagreement between people of goodwill. It's a battle between God and Satan. So the ends justify the means. The long-term strategy is to gain control of all state and local offices, from school boards to Secretary of State, and influence judicial appointments.
So let's zoom out to the broader implications. What are the social vulnerabilities that make this ideology so potent?
The single greatest factor Hedges identifies is profound despair. The movement acts as a radical counter-narrative to feelings of loss, abandonment, and deep pessimism.
Especially in economically depressed regions.
Former manufacturing states in the Midwest that have seen decades of job losses and decay, the psychological appeal is certainty in a fragmented culture.
Hedges mentions that many people he interviewed had contemplated suicide before their conversion.
The movement offers meaning, total certitude, and a powerful community structure that was missing in their lives. And the ecstatic expectation of the rapture plays a key psychological role in this reversal of roles.
It's comforting to those marginalized by society.
It promises they'll be elevated and their tormentors destroyed, and this belief allows them to privatize their morality, to focus solely on their own community and ignore broader social responsibility.
Which is how they can condemn social welfare programs without hesitation.
We see that with the convert Learned, who blamed welfare recipients for society's problems, saying they're creating babies all over the place. This condemnation creates distance and justifies the movement's focus on unfettered capitalism over social safety nets.
And Hedges links this back to historical authoritarianism.
He does. Like all totalitarian movements, the Christian right has this inability to cope with ambiguity and doubt. It places a premium on action, on certainty, and it finds its final aesthetic in war and apocalyptic violence.
So what's the ultimate warning here?
The theologian Paul Tillich warned against this. Democracy requires that religious faith stay in the private sphere. That ensures mutual tolerance and prevents the individual from being subsumed by the crowd, which is the chief goal of totalitarianism. Hedges ends with a stark warning from Julian Adams, who worked with the anti-Nazi church.
What was the warning?
If American society loses hope for a brighter future, a belief that rational reform can solve problems, the specter of American fascism will inevitably beset the nation.
So what's the biggest takeaway for someone listening to this deep dive?
I think it brings us to the final, really provocative thought that Hedges presents, one that turns the mayor back on the defenders of democracy. The movement's success relies not just on its own ruthlessness, but on the moral failure of those who fail to confront them.
Those who treat them as a legitimate player in an open society.
So tolerance coupled with passivity becomes a vice, not a virtue, in this context.
It's a dangerous vice.
The movement isn't seeking dialogue. It views pluralism as a sickness to be eradicated. It is patiently waiting for a national crisis, a major terrorist attack, an economic meltdown, an environmental disaster to manipulate the resulting fear and shred the Constitution in the name of national security. Understanding this ideological framework is a crucial first step toward defending democratic institutions. For a concise visual summary of the major themes in American Fascists, from apocalyptic ideology to authoritarian hierarchy, see the mini explainer linked to the description.